noticed when I was a child, I used to pass by a pharmacy.
Mm-hmm.
They used to have a picture of a snake.
Yes.
Does that have anything to do with the medicine, according to the Bible?
I think so.
That would be healed.
Sounds Greek.
Yeah.
Sounds Greek.
What's his name? The messenger god of the Greeks. Doesn't he have snakes?
Caduceus.
Which one?
Caduceus, right.
Fiducian?
Right.
You can do a stick with the snakes wrapped around it.
Oh, yeah.
Looks like DNA. I think that's what Mercury used to.
Yeah. It's
I never studied the
So
knowledge.
it's in
Does
the
that have anything to do with it?
the caduceus is in the hand of Mercury is not a symbol of medicine. The rod of Asclepius. I'm just looking at Wikipedia now.
Mm-hmm.
Is associated with medicine. So
The rod, Scorpius.
Asclepius, yeah, is
J. Asclepius. Brooklyn.
Asclepius. Yeah. So what's the origins of the Greek symbol
The snake.
of the snake? Certainly the we can't ignore the similarity. There's no primary source that connects the two symbols. But
Two symbols.
the rod of Asclepius and Moses' bronze serpent. You know the story with the Moses bronze
We
serpent?
had it at last Parshat.
Yes. Moshe, there was a attack of snakes. Fiery serpents were attacking the Jewish people in the camp. And so God said, make a serpent out of bronze and place it on the top of a pole. And whoever has been bitten shall look at the serpent and live.
Yeah, one thinks of a serpent and think of venom, the opposite of healing. So that is a surprising symbol of healing.
Yes, it is a surprising symbol of healing. What's the relationship between so first of all, actually I find this a very interesting story, because so the Talmud says, does then the snake give life and death? Rather, that a person shall look at the snake, but in turn they're raising their eyes upwards. And by raise right. So the idea is that the snake doesn't give life, but when a person raises their eyes to the heavens and they see and they consider the hand of Hashem, they devote their heart to Hashem, so that then becomes the source of their healing, right? But nonetheless, you can't escape the symbolism of the snake. Why then are we looking at the snake? Meaning, in a way, potentially the snake could really is a distraction from looking up to the heaven, right? As a matter of fact, the story is told that at one point in history, the snake was destroyed.
This particular snake,
Yeah.
this bronze snake.
Because it had become an icon. People were beginning to pray to the snake to save them from their health, to heal them. Right. So we understand that it's a fraught, it's a dangerous way to get somebody to look up to the heavens, to put up the snake. But I think that there's symbolism in the snake itself, because the snake is the symbol of poison. But think of the first snake in the Torah, right? The first snake in the Torah is the story of the of Adam and Eve, and the snake represents the externalization of the human failure, of the flawed human being, right? So the snake represents the externalized lusts and poor judgment and temptation. That's the word I'm looking for. It's the externalized temptation, right? It's Adam and Eve don't see anything particular about the fruit. The snake comes along and says, look at this fruit, you should want it, right? And so it's the human temptation externalized to the snake. And the sages teach that afterwards, after having taken of the fruit, we internalized that snake mentality. We began to embody it ourselves. It was no longer externalized to the snake. We began to own that temptation. Or in kabbalistic language, we then became me'orav b'tov v'ra. We then became intertwined and mixed of good and evil, whereas prior to that, the human was innocent and the temptation was in the snake, right? So they were externalized, differentiated. Yeah? You get it? So now we can go back to the idea of the serpent on the pole, and we can understand the deep symbolism there, which is look at the snake, but look at it upward. Realize that the snake is actually subservient to God also. Meaning, don't see the snake as an entity for itself. You need to look at the snake, because the problem is the snake. But how are you going to be able to overcome the temptations of the snake that are inside of you, that are inside of me? By looking upwards at it and seeing it in its source. Associate the snake with Hashem and recognize that the snake was created by Hashem. That this idea that we have temptation at all is created by God. And so when we see it for what it is, it takes some of the it could be a good coping mechanism. It could be a good encouragement to withstand the temptation, because it's meaning when you understand the source, that it's not really my temptation. I'll give you an example. One of the major teachings of psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy is that you are not your thoughts. Right? This is one of the big yesodis. We have thoughts. We are not our thoughts. And people often become so disoriented by the fact that they thought something. Without creating that distance between me and the fact that I had a thought, we identify with those thoughts and we become anxious and disoriented as a result. And so creating space between those thoughts and ourselves, right? So what we're doing in that moment is we're seeing the source of the thought, right? We're seeing the source of the thought and we're identifying it as being something that has its own source, right? So, or another example, when somebody is offensive, when somebody speaks in an offensive way, right? So if I see the source of that offensive talk and I recognize that the person is going through a hard time or they're stressed out or whatever, so now I no longer once I see the source for the source, I no longer get so disoriented and anxious by it or offended by it because I see the source. Right? And I'm able to put it in context.
They say don't take it personally.
Right.
But we still need temptation in life.
So now we
We
understand.
have to balance it.
Absolutely. So that's definitely the background of this point, which is seeing the context of the temptation. So first of all, we should know that Hashem created the temptation. Why did Hashem make temptation? Why do we need temptation? So that's a question that we would then ask, meaning going back to the idea of the thought, right? Once we create space between ourselves and our thoughts, we could say, where's this thought coming from? Why am I having this thought? Begin to hold it at arm's length and begin to analyze it. Oh, sometimes it could be something so simple as I didn't get a good night's sleep, and therefore I'm a little bit more vulnerable. Or I'm hungry, I'm a little more vulnerable. It's the yard site of my whatever, and therefore I'm a little more emotional. Sometimes these subconscious things. Oh, that's what it is. Oh, okay, now I understand, right? So once we create the space between ourselves and the thought, it becomes possible to question, where is this coming from and what's its source? Oh, this person offended me. No. They said an offensive thing. Where is it coming from? Oh, I began to think, maybe he's stressed. Maybe he's having a hard time. Maybe he misunderstood. There's all kinds of other potential explanations once we have space. And the same thing is for the snake. Put the snake up on the pole and recognize that it's not me. It came from Hashem. And now once we've created that space between ourselves and the snake, we could say, well, why is it important for us to have temptation? So that's already the therapeutic conversation that ensues once we've created that space. Right? So good. So why do we need temptation? Right? So this is the big story in the Zohar. You know the story in the Zohar? I told this already. You know the story?
Well, what I got it, if there was no temptation, there would not be procreation.
That too. Yeah.
That's the one I know.
Yeah.
Is there anything else?
I think that I'll turn the question around, okay? Yes, without in this world as it is, our procreation comes through temptation, definitely. I wonder, however, what particularly what is the characteristic effect on our world that productivity comes with temptation? And it's not only procreation, it also goes that productivity comes from greed and competition, right? Those are two major drivers of human accomplishment, is greed and competition.
We can have competition and learning, which is wonderful.
Yes, and the same way that there's a well-placed, there is a healthy version of temptation also, right? And there's a healthy version of competition, and there's a healthy version of appetite. Instead of greed, call it appetite, right? So there's lots of selfishness also. It has a healthy place, right? Because if we don't take care of ourselves, we don't have a healthy sense of self, then we can't operate in the world, right? So so what's the characteristic outcome of so if from a Hasidus point of view, we would say that it creates a unified world, a world in which productivity and accomplishment can sometimes border on the sinful, not meaning not that it's actually sinful, but that it borders on the sinful, that it draws on the same energy that leads to sin, right? Creates the capacity to create a more integrated and unified world, where the snake is also serving God.
In the story of Adam and Eve and the snake, of the snake and Eve, I don't know if I got this from the Horatius or some other rendering, that the snake is described as wily.
Mm-hmm.
It's
and
what?
Wily.
What
Yeah.
is wily?
Arom.
Oh, Arum.
And he uses logic. He uses reasoning. That
What
reasoning
seems to
for
be.
him is a tool.
Yeah.
He wants to convince her. And I've always thought of reasoning as a positive thing.
Mm-hmm.
It was my job as a mathematician to reason through certain things and to come to conclusions. And here it is portrayed, maybe for the first time in the Bible, as a tool
Yeah.
of evil.
Right.
So this story is clouding my mind when I'm listening to you.
Yeah.
Try to get it out.
Yeah. No, I hear that. It's a very interesting a note that the idea of reason being a tool rather than being the highest form of human investigation
Mm-hmm.
and the pursuit of truth, right? So yes, I think that it's not out of the question. Look, certainly in our
Jewish virtue, it seems to me. Reason.
yes,
Definitely.
true.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between true reason and cynical reason,
Mhm.
right? So if a person approaches an agenda, if a person approaches an idea with an agenda, they can construct a reasoning so as to support their agenda, right? But and that in a way is the worst of all.
Mhm. There's a book, famous book, How to Lie with Statistics.
Which
Hmm.
one?
How to lie with statistics.
Is it not bad?
Yeah.
Well, it just came to mind. Doesn't it say in Bereshit, "Turvu mil'u et haaretz v'kibshuha"?
What's that?
Be fruitful and multiply. The rest the Rabbi will. It's a
And
very
fill the
long-
earth and conquer it.
Fill the earth and conquer it. Not conquer. It's not with guns. Civilize it.
Civilize it is a good, yeah.
Improve it. We have to stretch the word, and it has a lot of meaning.
Colonize it.
Colonize it, yeah. Civilize it,
Colonialize it.
educate it, improve it.
Use it for
For,
positive.
yeah,
Use it for growth. Use
for
it
growth, for
food. Use it
improvement.
for
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So the idea that reason has to be grounded in sincerity is very important. And so again, right, reason, we have to start out with, I think also even starting out with no agenda is not so wise. We have to have a clear agenda before we ask a question, right? You won't get the right answer if you don't ask the right question. And in order to asking the right question involves knowing what your agenda is. In a sense, I know that the word agenda has kind of connotations that are distracting.
As long as the way you hold the agenda is, I don't know. I mean, you can say,
Sacred knowledge.
My original agenda turns out to be wrong. I mean, what originally thought I was going for, I now in my investigation see was incorrect, and the answer I'm looking for was not what I started out thinking it was.
Right.
Wasn't the snake trying to manipulate the woman? It's reasoning, but
Yes.
it's manipulation.
Yes. Yes. And that's the whole point, is that manipulation is cynical reasoning.
Right.
It's the use of, as you said, the use of reason as a tool
Mhm.
rather than the pursuit of something. through reason, or
Mhm.
I don't know if it's different, but it really comes down to the agenda.
Mhm.
That was interesting.
Yeah. So the snake. So we have to remember to put the snake in the context of Hashem, and to remember that the snake is that these human natures that we have, these snake-like natures that we have, are not us. They're something given to us, and not only something given to us, but they're given to us by God. And not only are they given to us by God, it's the most powerful dynamic that exists in the world, namely the capacity to transform or to incorporate even the darkest corners of the earth into the improvement of the world, into the
Because without the temptation, we're not going to try to do anything. We're
right.
gonna
So
let ourselves just sit and be thankful for what we have and not.
right. So like I said, so I just want to take a step away. I want to take a step, take a maybe look at it. The world in which we live is such that without temptation we wouldn't have it. But is it possible to create the world another way? Yes. I mean, I'll give you an example. We don't breathe. We don't breathe because of temptation. It's a natural. It's a autonomic reflex, right? Animals don't have temptation, at least not that we know of. It doesn't appear to. They act on instinct, right? So why is it that these most critical accomplishments of the human are tied up with the snake-like attitude, with temptation, with greed, with competitiveness, with selfishness? Why is it tied up? So what I'm saying is the advantage of that is that we are incorporating if the improving of the world would only be done by only half of the world would be elevated if if we did this with only our neshama, with only our higher self, with only our altruistic aspirations, or even with only our instincts, right? The world, there would always be this dark corner of the world that remains evil. We would have this idea of temptation, and we would have this idea of selfishness and jealousy and all of that, and they would be in this closet. It would be this skeleton in the closet that we have to lock away, that exists but is evil and is locked away, and we don't want to have anything to do with it because we're doing just fine without it. Meaning, right, in a world in which we could accomplish all of these things, procreation and development and all that, where we would accomplish that instinctively the way animals do, right? So the evil in the world would be locked away in a closet. But like this, we have the capacity to bring the evil out of the closet and to make a partner with it and to actually transform it so that ultimately the whole world becomes good. Even the temptation becomes a good thing. Even the dark corners of the world, even our limitations become a source of light. The darkness itself becomes a source of light, which is only possible in this construct. This is the big Hasidic idea of Tzimtzum Eino Kipshuto. You familiar with this idea?
I've heard of Tzimtzum, but
Yes.
not the-
So there's a big debate around the Tzimtzum.
So tzimtzum is a limitation.
Yeah, so the idea is that in the beginning, before all things, there was only God, right? In an infinite state, in an essential state, right? In order to create a world, God had to conceal himself, right? Meaning, as we spoke already many times, the creation is the world. This world that we live in, this paradigm that we live in, is the world of specificity. Everything has a specific time and place, and therefore, by definition, is also limited. Right? God, in that essential infinite state, is not limited. There's no limitation. Is not something that we're aware of in that moment, right? And so, in order to create a world, God has to sort of conceal his infinite presence in order to make space, in order to make it possible to have specificity, in order to make it possible for a person to have the experience of self, right? And to know that I end here and you begin there, right? So God has to conceal himself to make room for the world, in Lurianic kabbalistic language. So what do we do? This is called the tzimtzum, the act of God's concealing himself or contracting himself. So there's a big debate that goes back to the origins of the Hasidic movement. This was the fundamental argument. So it's funny to imagine the amount of intensity that was around. I mean, if you don't understand the ramifications of the argument, which we'll get to in a moment, it's hard to understand why there was such a big fight over this, right? But anyways, the debate was: is the tzimtzum literal? Should the idea of tzimtzum be taken literal, or should the idea of tzimtzum not be taken literal? Is tzimtzum kipshuto or not kipshuto? And essentially, the question is: when we say that God concealed himself, did he actually conceal himself? Did he actually contract his presence? Or did he only make it appear as though he had contracted his presence? So the hot point argument, for example, was: is God in the bathroom? Is God in the bathroom?
In the what?
In the privy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. In the water closet. Yeah.
Bet kavod.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it on one hand, we know that we're not allowed to speak words of Torah in such a place. It's an unclean place. So would you say that God's presence, would you put God in such a chas v'shalom, right? So you're saying that God's presence, that it is possible that there's a conflict between the presence of God and the presence of uncleanness or evil. This conflict. On the other hand, the Hasidic view said that while we have to behave that way, in truth, God is everywhere. And in a sense, there is a higher and more transcendent, more unlimited presence of God that is in the concealment. There is the revealed presence of God that is manifestly holy, but that's specifically holy. And then there is the essential presence of God that's everywhere, that's always there, even in the unclean place, right? And this goes back to this idea that the snake ultimately is incorporated. It's a very Messianic teaching also, because we're saying that the snake is going to be incorporated into the redemption. Ultimately, when all things come to the conclusion, when the last stroke is written, when the final note is played, when we come to the happy ending, we will see how the snake too was part of our productivity. And so thus it becomes revealed retroactively that God was even in the snake. So this is the idea of Tchias HaMesim also, the resurrection of the dead, which is Chamisha Mesu Be'ityo Shel Nachash. There were several people in our tradition that say they were so holy they shouldn't have died but for the bite of the snake, but for the essential state of sin that exists in this world since the snake, right? And so death is essentially a function of the limited state of human life. Meaning the fact that human life is human and is in God. Everything that's godly is eternal. Right? And everything that's not godly will die. Death is the opposite of God is death. Right? So if the snake, because of the snake, therefore there's death in the world. That's what happened after the sin. Right? So so the resurrection of the dead says that the body, which was the limitator of the soul, which was the limiter of the soul, itself will come to life and live in eternity. The snake's skin will come back to life. Which is to say that, right, and now because in the end, the body is no longer seen as a conflict to the soul, but the partner of the soul, or that the present we or in different words, we begin to see the presence of God in the body, and thus why should the body die?
Years ago, I had to teach about creation to children. And before I taught them, I had to teach the teachers who were all Russian. And I had to do a lot of research about the 6 days of the week and Shabbat. A lot I went into, and I delved into the sort of resources. And I saw the limitation, tzimtzum, perhaps in a different way that what I've heard here. And I explained it. The tzimtzum was that everything that we have in the world was not created perfect, was created, and God left it for us to improve on. This is how I understood it.
Yes.
It was more logical, the people who I worked with.
Yeah.
I taught that everything was tzimtzum, whether it's let's say the perfect is a diamond, right? But before the diamond is the rough. So we have everything rough in this world, and we create something out of it, whether it's a plant, we make medicine, we make fruit, we eat food. And there's a lot of work that we have to do in order to make bread.
Yeah.
And every daddy who works and has a different mission is a person who improves on the world, whether he's a doctor, he's a farmer, he is a lawyer, or he is a sweeper. He sweeps the streets.
Right.
So so each one of us has a mission in life to improve on it. This is what I understand.
Okay, it's beautiful. I love it. I would just point out that in your description,
yes,
you went one step beyond the tzimtzum, meaning the tzimtzum is the fact that everything is imperfect. Everything is, and then we have an obligation
to improve the world,
to transcend the tzimtzum,
yes,
right? And so that's exactly the same thing, meaning everything is created in a limited state.
yes,
And limited, meaning every problem that we have in this world is due to the fact that we have reached the limits of our capacity. Right? That's the problem of human existence, that frustration, pain, anger, right? All of those things is when we meet a limitation. Right?
So I was in the right track.
Absolutely. And I love how you brought this out, because I want to just flush out the thought, because I love how this idea can be can
be more practical.
Yeah, and you see this very abstract idea in very practical,
simple,
very practical things.
Simple, practical, which
Right.
makes sense to them, and I can pass it to the teachers who pass it to the students.
Right. So the limit the fact that something is limited, that it isn't part of we don't see how it's part of the perfect transcendence of the universe, right? That's kind of going back into the abstract language again, right? Going back to the stone, right? Why is the stone a stone? Because the stone is a stone. Why is it not something else, right? So in the world before the Tzimtzum, there was not even a stone, because there's just perfect love, and that's it. That's all you need is love, right? And then you got my reference. But then we have this idea that there are things now, and everything is limited, and everything comes with its own problem, which is the fact that it's limited. And that the ultimate limitation is the limitation on life. Meaning, if you want to talk the archetypal limitation, right, is life is that idea of love, is that idea of existence, is the idea of the infusion of God's presence into an inanimate thing is life, and the limitation of that is death. I mean, that's the ultimate symptom, right? And the snake is the symbol of that. So going back to the diamond in the rough, right? The diamond is a stone. Why is a stone a stone? Because it's limited to a stone. Now we took this symptom, we took this specific thing, and we found beauty in the specificity of that thing. We discovered the kunz. We discovered the joy that comes out of interacting with something limited. There's some kind of very special sense of accomplishment that comes in working with a limited world. And that's the improvement on the tzimtzum, and that's tchias hamesim, meaning that we can understand that death isn't here to kill us. Death is here to give meaning to our lives. Right? Death isn't the end of life. Death is created by God in the tzimtzum, in the act of creating a creation. There's a divine fingerprint even in death itself, and once we realize it, then we are able to even see the presence of God there. And when that truth becomes really apparent, then we live for eternity. Then we have no death anymore, because the death is no longer. We begin to appreciate and realize that everything is actually life. That's the symbolism behind what the literal. I'm not going into the mechanics of the resurrection, right? I'm talking about why it's theologically important that we have this idea. It's because it says that the tzimtzum, not only is the tzimtzum not here to kill us, it's here to bring
The best in us.
bring out the best in us, right? It's here to bring out the best in us, and not only that, but that we should recognize that it's actually God's agent. Tzimtzum is God's doing. And that's the story in the Zohar. The story in the Zohar is that there was a king who had a son, and he knew that the son was going to be king after him. And he was very worried that the son was going to grow up spoiled and naive. And that would not make a very good king. And so he sent him out, and the king then hired a businesswoman. You understand what I'm saying? He hired a businesswoman, and he gave her a lot of money. You know, in ancient times, women didn't have businesses, right? But she had a business, and he gave her a lot of money to go and do her business on his son. That she should try and make a client out of him. And so the king sends the son out into the market, and he sends him on an errand, gives him a bag of gold, and he says, go see what's out there. And who should he meet? As the evening comes, he met this businesswoman, and she starts working him, right? And so in this moment, what does the king want? Right? So this is the Zohar tells us. What does the king want? The king wants that this woman should try her best. And he paid her well. But what does he really want? He wants not that the son should become a client, but that the son should learn what life is all about. That the son should experience what people go through in life when they live in the real world. Right? And maybe this is a bit heretical. This isn't how Chassidus generally understands the story. But maybe even if the son fails, and then later does teshuvah, that too is an important lesson. That the king never wants to happen, but it fulfills the purpose.
I don't understand why he sent him to this woman. It just doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense to you?
If there are instincts and there are temptations in the world, eventually he will go to that woman. He doesn't have, the king has better things to teach him in life. There are so many wonderful things he can teach.
Okay, so
I don't think you need much teaching in that area.
You're asking a kasha famaisa, the kasha famaisa, right? This is the thinking behind it, right? Meaning, it's a mashal, right? It's not a true story, right? It's a parable. But the idea is that we're embracing it. This story kind of brings out the dual motivations that go on in the mind of the king, where on the one hand, he watches, he's proud of his son for withstanding temptation, and he knows that there are certain life lessons that can only be learned in the context of temptation. There are certain things that you learn about yourself, and that you learn about the world, and a sense of humility and maturity and all these things that are not possible if a person lives a sheltered existence, right? So this, on the one hand, the king is very happy that the son is learning these lessons. On the other hand, he's secretly hoping that this king is going to withstand the temptation. On the other hand, he recognizes that the lesson can only be learned if the temptation is strong, right? So on the one hand, he wants the temptation to be strong. On the other hand, he wants the son to be stronger than the temptation. But the reality is that it might not go as he plans, right? So I think it brings out in many ways this whole idea of the position, the relationship that we have with temptation, but more importantly, the relationship that God has with our temptations. And then again, it's not the snake that brings life or death. It's God. It's God that makes. So there's a question and an answer, and they're making two separate points. On the one hand, we say is the source of life and death the snake? And the answer to that is no. The source of life and death is not the snake. It's God who created the snake. And that's an answer to itself. Now, how are you going to transcend the snake? If we will look upward and be aware of this idea that the snake is not our source of life and death, but that even our temptation is a gift from God, then the temptation is no longer seen as a threat, a spiritual threat. And that can kind of give us some cognitive distance from the anxiety around the temptation. We can have a more integrated existence. Good. Should we talk about Parshas Balak now?
Sure.
Balaam was, in the language of Rab Nachman, Balaam was a frumme guy. Okay.
He was a Navi.
Not in a, and when we say a
Not
frum,
in Kiddush.
right? Now, when we say frum, we don't mean that he was a devout. Not that he was devout, but that he had the act of being devout. The rabbis interpret the words ha'askeni skanti. Balaam had a pet. You know what's Balaam's pet? Balaam had a pet donkey. He was very, very close with this donkey.
I thought it was a snake.
No, right. No. Yeah, not a pet snake. Balaam had a donkey that he was very, very close with. He was intimate with his donkey. This is it. He was a weird guy, Balaam. Balaam was a weird guy. Not Balaam, yeah, the prophet Balaam was a weird guy. He was into some weird stuff, right? So this Balaam represents the non-integrated spirituality, where on the one hand he appears very devout and he goes, making rituals and worshiping, and I only listen to God, and a religious practitioner, right? But actually, he was a pretty weird guy. He was into some weird stuff.
He was a man of money.
That too. It's a symbol. This idea that by day Balaam is praying and worshiping and prophesying, and by night he's spending the night with his donkey, is a symbol of the cynicism, the lack of integrity, the lack of integration that he has with his religious life.
Why would God give a man like him the gift of prophecy?
Why would God give a man like Balaam the gift of prophecy?
Why waste it on him? Well, I'm not here to judge, but I mean, it's a waste.
It's a good question.
Well, of course.
Now, I'll put your question in different words.
Okay.
How can God's presence live in someone like Balaam?
Right. Because it's too, it's
Right.
impure.
Yeah.
How could he, to be a prophet, you have to be a super ordinary human being.
Yeah.
In order to have some kind of contact, whether you dream or there's some kind of communication between you and God, and
Right.
it has to be, as you said, we cannot have in Bet Kavod spirituality.
Right. So
Why would it be like that?
I think that Balaam might be following from our previous discussion about how God is in the snake,
Yeah.
right? Here is the illogical extreme that can be taken to.
Is that
Meaning
the symptom?
this is the danger, right? The danger of this idea, and actually the reason that those who were against the Hasidic philosophy were concerned about, is that it's actually a very dangerous idea, because it can lead to righteous hedonism. It can lead to permissive and reckless type of life, where you say, well, God is everywhere, God is in everything, God is in the snake too, it doesn't matter if I sin, it doesn't matter if I'm righteous, it doesn't matter, God is everywhere, right? So Balaam is then, and going back to the snake, right, and the reason of the reasoning of the snake is to say that we have to be very careful to not fall into the trap of it's God. Look, it's possible for God to be manifest everywhere because God is everywhere, but that can result in cynicism and evil and non-integrated and a non-integrated spirituality, meaning we have this idea that just because God is there, therefore it's good and it's okay, right? And that's not true. Not everything that works should be done. Right? Just because it is doesn't mean it's okay. And I think that's, in a way, the lesson of Balaam is that yes, God is there. And yes, there it's prophecy can come from negativity. But that doesn't mean that Balaam is a good guy. And the story actually comes out in the end, meaning actually it's what's two thoughts come at the same time, so I don't know what to do first. One of Balaam's major features of Balaam's prophecy is the prophecy of Mashiach, which again, going back to this idea of the resurrection of the dead and the idea of the final stroke, the final note is looking back and seeing how even in the snake is the creation of God, right? That's it. It's so poignant that the ideas of the Messianic evolution of the world and the world coming to its perfected state come out of a guy like Balaam, right? So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, Balaam remains evil in this moment, as we see that when he couldn't get his curses out, he found another way to try and ruin the Jewish people, and that's by he gave an idea to Balak, to the king of Midian, to say, well, if you I wasn't able to be successful in cursing the Jews with my words, and so what you need to do is get the Jews to sin, and then they will have cursed themselves, right? So that and that's what happened, and then we follow in next week in the Parsha of Pinchas. At the end of the reading, if you read the last passage of the Parsha, what page is it on? You'll see. It's yeah, here we are. That's page 681. Okay, so that's what happened. It's that's Numbers 25:1. So that's the story that. So on the one hand, Balaam is Balak. On the one hand, Balaam is the Messianic prophet, because the Messianic prophecy comes from, meaning that the Messianic prophecy is the idea that which was unholy will become that which seemed unholy will be revealed to be holy. Meaning redemption implies that there was a time of exile. That which was always holy doesn't need redemption. The holy world doesn't need to be brought to an elevated state. It's already in an elevated state. What needs to be brought to an elevated state? That which was in a fallen state. Right? So Geula is only possible. Geula is only possible in that which was in Gola, in that which was in Galut. Meaning that which was always holy doesn't need Geula. Hashem doesn't need geula. Hashem doesn't need redemption because tzaddikim don't need. The righteous live in that elevated state anyways. So that's why Balaam has to be the Messianic prophet, because it's specifically out of Balaam's mouth that we're able to get the foretaste. Balaam blessing the Jews is a foretaste of what Mashiach might look like. At the same time, don't think that Balaam, as he is right now, is good. And this is what we're learning about in the Talmud now. In the third chapter of Brachot, or is it the second chapter? Third chapter of Brachot. The idea that it's not permitted to speak, to teach Torah in a cemetery, or that we're supposed to cover our tzitzis in the cemetery, right? Which is we don't flaunt our mitzvahs in front of the dead, which is
Why?
So it said that we're loig l'rosh, that we're scoffing at the dead. So the Talmud says a fascinating story. It says the story was Rabbi Mendelson and Rabbi are walking in the cemetery, and Rabbi Yonason's tzitzis fell out, and were touching the floor. So Rabbi said, cover your tzitzis, pick up your tzitzis, because the dead will say, tomorrow they're coming to us, and today they're making fun of us. Tomorrow they're going to be dead. Tomorrow, meaning not tomorrow necessarily tomorrow, but these men are destined to die, and now they're pretending like they're better than us.
So out of respect.
Yeah. Well, what's the respect? What's the problem? In it's a fact that we have, meaning we live in this world, we're expected to do mitzvahs, and actually there is a holiness that we have. And what's wrong with it? The answer is that the idea, the awareness that the body can be used for a sense of mitzvahs, and ignoring the state of death that exists in the body, is a naivete that can lead a person to miss the dangers of the temptations. Meaning we have to be mindful of, while on the one hand being aware of the potential and capacity for holiness in the body and for mitzvahs in the body, which are actually only possible in the body, we also have to be mindful and aware of the capacity for death and temptation and weakness and failure that exists within the body.
Could it be that it's being haughty and not naive?
I think haughtiness is a form of naivete.
Okay. Could be.
Right? It's a lack of attention to one's own limitations. It's like, humility is a deep awareness of self. Healthy humility, right, is a deep awareness of self. Is a mindfulness of self, right? One is mindful of their own limitations, but haughtiness is oblivious in a way. There's a certain there's a certain blindness that's required in order for a person to be haughty, right? Which is also a kind of naivete. Naivete is maybe a little kind, right? It's a kinder way of putting it. So the idea so Balaam reminds us that while God is present in the snake, at the same time, we should never forget that the snake is still a snake. I think that